Hi guys! Welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest chapters.
Tonight, we're traveling back to 15th century Spain, to a time when religious fervor and political power combined to create one of history's most feared institutions.
The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just a religious court system, it was a machinery of control, fear, and persecution that would shape Spain and its territories for over 3 centuries. We'll explore how ordinary people lived in constant fear of accusation, how entire communities were destroyed by suspicion, and how the quest for religious purity became a tool for social and political dominance. From the grand halls of power where these policies were conceived, to the intimate stories of families torn apart by false accusations, tonight's journey will take us through the human cost of fanaticism. We'll meet merchants who lost everything to confiscation, scholars who watched their life's work burn, and ordinary citizens who learned to live with the knowledge that any neighbor might be an informant. This isn't just a story about the past, it's about how fear can be weaponized, how communities can turn against themselves, and how the pursuit of purity often creates the very corruption it claims to fight. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The year was 1478, and Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon had just united their kingdoms through marriage, creating what we now know as Spain. But their vision of unity went far beyond political boundaries. They dreamed of a nation united under one faith, one culture, and one crown. The problem, as they saw it, was that Spain was a tapestry of different religions and cultures that had coexisted for centuries. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had lived side by side in many Spanish cities, creating a rich blend of traditions, knowledge, and commerce. But for Isabella and Ferdinand, this diversity wasn't a strength. It was a threat to their vision of a purified Christian kingdom. The Catholic monarchs, as they came to be known, had witnessed the power of religious unity in other parts of Europe. They had seen how shared faith could bind subjects to their rulers, how religious conformity could create social stability, and how the church could serve as an arm of royal authority. But Spain was different. In cities like Toledo, Cordoba, and Seville, you could hear Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin spoken on the same street. Christian churches stood near Jewish synagogues and Islamic mosques. Scholars from different faiths debated philosophy and science in university halls. This cosmopolitan atmosphere had made Spain one of the intellectual centers of medieval Europe, but it also made the monarchs nervous. The immediate concern wasn't actually the practicing Muslims and Jews. Those communities were visible and known. The real fear centered on the conversos, the converted Christians who had previously been Muslim or Jewish. These conversions had been happening for decades, sometimes by choice, but often under pressure from local authorities or economic necessity. Many conversos had integrated fully into Christian society, rising to positions of prominence in government, the church, and commerce. Some had intermarried with old Christian families, creating complex webs of religious ancestry that made simple categories impossible. The economic success of many converso families added another layer of complexity to the situation. In cities like Seville, Toledo, and Barcelona, conversos dominated certain professions and trades. They were prominent as tax collectors, a profession that naturally created resentment among the general population. They controlled significant portions of the silk trade, the spice trade, and international banking. Their success in these areas was partly due to their continued connections with Jewish and Muslim communities in other parts of Europe and North Africa, connections that proved invaluable for international commerce. This economic prominence created a dangerous dynamic. Old Christian families often found themselves in debt to converso bankers or in competition with converso merchants. Artisan guilds complained that converso craftsmen were taking business away from Christian workers. The economic anxiety created by this competition made many people receptive to rumors about the religious sincerity of their successful converso neighbors. The situation was further complicated by the fact that many conversos maintained cultural practices that had nothing to do with religion but appeared suspicious to outside observers. They might prepare certain foods according to traditional recipes, observe family customs that had been passed down for generations, or maintain business relationships with Jewish or Muslim communities in other countries. These practices were often purely cultural rather than religious, but they could easily be interpreted as evidence of continued adherence to their original faith. The monarchs were also aware that converso families often possessed knowledge and skills that were valuable to the kingdom. Many conversos were highly educated, multilingual, and experienced in international affairs. They had connections throughout Europe and the Mediterranean that could be useful for diplomacy and trade. The challenge was to maintain access to these advantages while eliminating any potential disloyalty or religious contamination. The political context of the late 15th century added urgency to the Spain was emerging as a major European power, but it faced external threats from France, internal challenges from noble families who resisted centralized authority, and the ongoing project of completing the reconquista. The monarchs needed unity and loyalty from their subjects. The influence of prominent religious figures also shaped figures like Tomás de Torquemada, who would later become the first Grand Inquisitor, had been arguing for years that these religious advisors claimed to have evidence of widespread. They argued that tolerance of religious diversity would inevitably lead to corruption of the faith and weakening of royal authority. But rumors had been circulating for years that many of these conversions were superficial, that conversos were secretly maintaining their original faith while publicly professing Christianity. Stories spread of families who lit candles on Friday evenings, who refused to eat pork, or who seemed to know too much about Jewish law and customs. Similar whispers followed the moriscos, the converted Muslims, who were suspected of continuing Islamic practices behind closed doors. Whether these rumors were true or false mattered less than the fact that they created a climate of suspicion and uncertainty. The spread of these rumors was facilitated by the social tensions that existed in many Spanish cities. Economic competition between different communities created resentment that could easily be channeled into religious suspicion. Political rivalries between noble families sometimes played out through accusations of religious impurity. Personal disputes between neighbors or business partners could escalate into denunciations of heretical behavior. The role of popular preachers and religious agitators was particularly important in creating the climate that made the Inquisition possible. These figures traveled from city to city, delivering sermons that emphasized the dangers of religious contamination and the need for vigilance against crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims. They told stories of Christian children being kidnapped and subjected to ritual murder, of conversos poisoning wells or desecrating holy objects, of secret synagogues and mosques operating in Christian neighborhoods. These preachers understood how to tap into existing anxieties and grievances, transforming economic and social tensions into religious fervor. They created a narrative that explained away the successes of converso families by attributing them to supernatural assistance from demonic forces. They promised that the elimination of religious diversity would bring prosperity and divine blessing to Christian communities. The influence of these popular religious movements created pressure on the monarchs to take action against suspected heretics. Local authorities began demanding royal intervention to address the converso problem. Petitions arrived from various cities asking for permission to investigate and punish suspected crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims. The monarchs found themselves caught between their desire to maintain social order and their need to respond to popular pressure. The international context also influenced the monarch's decision to establish the Inquisition. Other European countries were dealing with similar issues related to religious minorities and social unity. France had expelled its Jewish population in 1306 and again in 1394. England had expelled Jews in 1290, and the idea that religious unity was necessary for political stability was becoming accepted wisdom throughout Christian Europe. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe created fears about Muslim influence and infiltration. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had shocked Christian Europe and created anxiety about Islamic power. Stories circulated about Ottoman spies and agents operating in Christian countries, often disguised as converted Muslims who maintained secret loyalty to the Sultan. These international fears merged with domestic anxieties about converso loyalty to create a climate of paranoia and suspicion. The monarchs faced a delicate political situation. They couldn't simply expel or persecute people who were technically Christians. They needed a mechanism that could investigate, judge, and punish those who were deemed false Christians while maintaining the appearance of religious and legal legitimacy. The solution they chose would reshape Spanish society for generations. They would establish their own version of the Inquisition, directly under royal control rather than papal authority. The Papal Inquisition had existed in various forms since the 13th century, primarily to combat heretical movements like the Cathars in France. But those earlier inquisitions had been controlled by the Pope and operated under church law. What Isabella and Ferdinand envisioned was different: a royal inquisition that would answer to them first and the Pope second. They wanted an institution that could serve their political goals while maintaining religious legitimacy.
In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull authorizing the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. The document gave the monarchs unprecedented power to appoint inquisitors and establish tribunals throughout their territories. But even the Pope seemed to have reservations about what he had authorized. Within a few years, he would write letters expressing concern about the severity of the Spanish Inquisition's methods and the extent of its authority. By then, however, it was too late. The institution had taken on a life of its own. The first tribunal was established in Seville in 1480, and within months, the city was transformed by fear. The inquisitors were not local clergy who knew the communities they served. They were outsiders, often from other regions of Spain, who had no personal connections to their subjects. This outsider status was intentional. The monarchs wanted judges who would be immune to local loyalties, family connections, or community pressures. They wanted men who would follow the law as written, regardless of personal consequences. The selection and training of inquisitors was a careful process that reflected the institution's dual religious and political purposes. Candidates were chosen not just for their theological knowledge, but for their loyalty to the crown and their ability to work independently of local influences. They underwent extensive training in interrogation techniques, legal procedures, and the identification of heretical beliefs and practices. The early inquisitors brought with them detailed manuals that described how to identify crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims. These manuals listed specific behaviors and practices that should be considered suspicious, from dietary habits to bathing customs to business practices. They included sample questions for interrogations and guidance on how to interpret prisoners' responses. They described the physical signs that supposedly indicated Jewish or Muslim ancestry and the behavioral patterns that revealed continued adherence to non-Christian faiths. The arrival of the Inquisition in any city followed a predictable pattern that maximized its psychological impact. The inquisitors would announce their presence with great ceremony, often coordinating with local civil and religious authorities to ensure maximum visibility. They would establish their headquarters in a prominent building, usually requisitioned from its previous owners, and begin the process of setting up their administrative and judicial apparatus. The physical presence of the Inquisition was designed to be intimidating and impressive. The buildings they occupied were marked with religious symbols and royal emblems that emphasized both the spiritual and political authority of the institution. Guards in distinctive uniforms patrolled the areas around Inquisition headquarters. Official proclamations were posted throughout the city, written in language that emphasized the gravity of heresy and the power of the institution to detect and punish it. The inquisitors also established networks of informants and collaborators that extended throughout the communities they investigated. These networks included not just voluntary informants who reported suspicious behavior, but also paid agents who actively investigated suspected heretics. Some of these agents posed as servants, merchants, or artisans to gain access to private homes and conversations. Others infiltrated converso communities by pretending to share their background and sympathies. The use of infiltration and entrapment
was one of the most insidious aspects of the Inquisition's methods. Agents would pose as crypto-Jews or crypto-Muslims to encourage suspected heretics to reveal their true beliefs. They would attend secret religious services, participate in traditional customs, and build relationships of trust with community members. Once they had gathered sufficient evidence, they would report their findings to the inquisitors, often leading to mass arrests of entire communities. The psychological warfare aspects of the Inquisition's operations were as important as the legal and administrative components. The institution deliberately created an atmosphere of uncertainty and paranoia that made normal social relationships difficult or impossible. People never knew who might be watching them, who might be reporting on their behavior, or who might be secretly working for the Inquisition. The procedures of the Spanish Inquisition were designed to be thorough, secretive, and psychologically devastating. When the inquisitors arrived in a new city, they would first proclaim a period of grace, typically 30 to 40 days, during which people could confess their own heresies or those of others without severe punishment. This period served multiple purposes. It gathered information about suspected heretics. It encouraged people to inform on their neighbors and family members, and it created the impression that the Inquisition was merciful to those who cooperated. But the period of grace also created a climate of paranoia that would persist long after the inquisitors moved on. Neighbors began watching each other for signs of religious deviation. Servants reported on their master's private conversations. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents' religious practices. The very fabric of community trust began to unravel as people realized that anyone might be gathering information for the Inquisition. The evidence required for an accusation was remarkably thin. Hearsay was acceptable. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged. Even the testimony of excommunicated persons, criminals, and Jews, normally excluded from Christian courts, could be used against suspected heretics. The accused were not told who had accused them or what specific charges they faced. They were simply arrested, often in the middle of the night, and taken to the Inquisition's private prisons. These prisons were unlike anything in the secular justice system. They were designed not just to hold prisoners, but to break their psychological resistance. Cells were small, dark, and often underground. Prisoners were isolated from family, friends, and even other prisoners. They had no access to legal counsel and were not told how long their imprisonment might last. Some people spent years in these conditions before their cases were even reviewed. The daily routine in Inquisition prisons was carefully designed to create maximum psychological pressure. Prisoners were awakened at irregular hours for questioning, or simply to prevent them from establishing comfortable routines. They were fed minimal rations at unpredictable times, creating constant hunger and uncertainty about when the next meal might come. The food itself was often deliberately unpalatable or religiously significant. Pork might be served to suspected crypto-Jews, for example, to test their reactions. The architecture of Inquisition prisons reflected the institution's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. Cells were designed to be just large enough to prevent physical collapse, but too small to allow comfortable movement. Windows, when they existed, were placed to provide minimal light and no view of the outside world. The buildings were constructed to amplify sounds in disturbing ways. Prisoners could hear footsteps, conversations, and screams from other parts of the prison, but could never determine exactly where these sounds originated or what they meant. The isolation imposed on prisoners was not just physical, but also spiritual and intellectual. They were denied access to books, writing materials, or any form of mental stimulation. They could not attend religious services or receive sacraments, creating spiritual anguish for devout Christians who had been accused of heresy. They were cut off from all news of the outside world, including information about their families, their businesses, or their legal cases. Prison guards were trained to maintain this atmosphere of isolation and uncertainty. They were instructed to provide minimal information to prisoners and to respond to questions with evasive or contradictory answers. They were forbidden from developing personal relationships with prisoners or showing sympathy for their situations. This impersonal treatment was designed to make prisoners feel completely abandoned and dependent on the inquisitors for any hope of resolution. The medical care provided to prisoners was minimal and often used as another form of psychological pressure. Sick prisoners might be denied treatment unless they confessed their heresies. Medical examinations were conducted to determine whether prisoners were physically capable of withstanding interrogation techniques. Prison doctors were required to report any information they learned about prisoners' backgrounds or beliefs during the course of their medical duties. The visiting policies of Inquisition prisons were designed to maximize the psychological impact on both prisoners and their families. Family members were sometimes allowed brief visits, but these visits were carefully monitored and could be terminated at any moment. The uncertainty about when visits might be permitted created additional anxiety for prisoners who desperately wanted contact with their loved ones, but never knew when or if such contact would be allowed. During these visits, family members were often pressured to provide information about the prisoner's religious practices and beliefs. Children were questioned about their parents' behavior at home. Spouses were asked about their partner's private conversations and activities. These visits became opportunities for gathering additional evidence rather than sources of comfort for imprisoned family members. The questioning process was elaborate and psychological. Inquisitors were trained to detect lies, to probe for inconsistencies in testimony, and to use the prisoner's own words against them. They would ask detailed questions about religious practices, family history, and personal beliefs. They would probe for knowledge that only a practicing Jew or Muslim would possess. They would set verbal traps designed to reveal hidden allegiances or secret practices. The interrogation techniques used by the Inquisition were sophisticated and systematically designed to break down psychological resistance. Inquisitors were trained in what we would today recognize as advanced psychological manipulation tactics. They understood how to use isolation, uncertainty, and fear to make prisoners more susceptible to their questioning. They knew how to exploit personal relationships, family loyalties, and religious beliefs to extract confessions and denunciations. The physical setting of interrogations was carefully designed to intimidate prisoners and emphasize the power imbalance between interrogator and subject. Interrogation rooms were typically located in basement areas of Inquisition buildings, with stone walls that created echoes and amplified voices. The furniture was minimal and uncomfortable. A simple chair for the prisoner and an elevated platform or throne-like seat for the inquisitor. Religious symbols and royal emblems decorated the walls, reminding prisoners of the spiritual and political authority they faced. Inquisitors employed a variety of questioning strategies that were designed to confuse and trap prisoners. They might begin with seemingly innocent questions about family history or childhood memories, gradually leading prisoners to reveal information that could be used against them. They would ask the same questions multiple times in different ways, looking for inconsistencies that could be interpreted as evidence of lying or concealment. The use of existing testimony and documentation was another sophisticated aspect of Inquisition interrogation techniques. Inquisitors often possessed detailed information about prisoners' lives, families, and activities that had been gathered through months or years of investigation. They would use this information strategically during interrogations, revealing just enough to demonstrate their knowledge while keeping prisoners uncertain about how much they actually knew. One particularly effective technique was the use of partial revelations about other family members or associates who had been arrested or investigated. An inquisitor might mention that a prisoner's brother had been questioned without revealing what the brother had said or whether he had been released or imprisoned. This technique created anxiety about family members while pressuring prisoners to confess or provide information that might protect their loved ones. The religious dimensions of Inquisition interrogations were particularly powerful because most prisoners were genuinely devout Christians who were horrified by accusations of heresy. Inquisitors exploited this devotion by framing their questions in terms of spiritual welfare and salvation. They would suggest that confession and repentance were necessary for the prisoner's soul, regardless of their guilt or innocence of the specific charges. The length and repetition of interrogation sessions were used as psychological weapons. Sessions might last for many hours, with prisoners subjected to intense questioning while standing or sitting in uncomfortable positions. The same questions might be asked dozens of times over multiple sessions, creating mental exhaustion that made prisoners more likely to give inconsistent answers or to confess simply to end the ordeal. Inquisitors also used temporal manipulation as an interrogation technique. They would create artificial urgency by suggesting that confession was only possible within a limited time frame. Or they would use extended delays to increase prisoners' anxiety and uncertainty. They might interrogate prisoners immediately after meals to take advantage of drowsiness, or they might wake prisoners in the middle of the night for questioning when their mental defenses were weakest. For many prisoners, the most devastating aspect of the process was not the physical conditions, but the intellectual and spiritual isolation. These were often educated, devout people who had lived their entire lives as Christians. To be accused of heresy
was to have their entire identity called into question. Some prisoners experienced what we might today recognize as psychological breakdowns, confessing to practices they had never engaged in, simply to end the uncertainty and isolation. The economic impact of an Inquisition investigation could be as devastating as the legal consequences.
When someone was arrested by the Inquisition, their property was immediately confiscated to pay for the costs of their investigation and imprisonment. This meant that even if they were eventually found innocent, they often emerged from prison to find themselves bankrupt.
Their businesses had been destroyed, their homes sold, their savings exhausted by legal fees and prison costs. This economic dimension of the Inquisition created perverse incentives that corrupted the entire system. The Inquisition was largely self-funding through property confiscations, which meant that inquisitors had financial reasons to find people guilty. Wealthy conversos became particularly attractive targets because their confiscated wealth could fund tribunal operations for months or years. Some historians have argued that the Spanish Inquisition was as much an economic institution as a religious one, a way for the crown to expropriate wealth from successful minority communities. The auto de fe became the most visible and terrifying aspect of the Spanish Inquisition. These were public ceremonies where the sentences of the Inquisition were announced and carried out. The name literally means act of faith, and the ceremonies were designed to be spectacular demonstrations of religious and royal authority. They typically took place in the main square of a city, with elaborate staging that included processions, sermons, and the reading of sentences. The preparation for an auto de fe was an elaborate process that involved months of planning and coordination between religious and civil authorities. The ceremony was designed to be a total sensory experience that would leave lasting impressions on all participants and spectators. Every detail, from the arrangement of seating to the timing of different segments, was carefully choreographed to maximize psychological and emotional impact. The construction of temporary stages and platforms for the auto de fe transformed the central squares of Spanish cities into theatrical venues for the display of inquisitorial power. These structures were decorated with religious imagery, royal symbols, and banners that proclaimed the authority of the Catholic faith and the Spanish crown. The visual impact was intended to overwhelm spectators with the majesty and power of the institutions they represented. The procession that began each auto de fe was itself a carefully orchestrated display of social hierarchy and religious authority. Representatives of different social classes, religious orders, and government institutions marched in predetermined order that reflected their relative importance in Spanish society. The placement of each group in the procession sent clear messages about social relationships and power structures. Religious confraternities, craft guilds, and municipal authorities all participated in these processions, carrying banners, crosses, and other symbols of their organizations. Their participation was not voluntary. Failure to participate could itself be interpreted as suspicious behavior that might lead to investigation. This mandatory participation ensured that the entire community became complicit in the ceremonies and their outcomes. The prisoners themselves were brought out in carefully orchestrated order that reflected their crimes and sentences. Those who had confessed and been reconciled to the church were presented first, often carrying candles as symbols of their return to the light of faith. They wore distinctive garments called sanbenitos that identified their status and served as visible reminders of their punishment. The sanbenitos, worn by different categories of prisoners, were designed to create a visual hierarchy of guilt and punishment. Yellow robes with red crosses identified those who had confessed and been reconciled. Black robes, decorated with flames and demons, marked those who had refused to confess or who were considered relapsed heretics. The most serious offenders wore robes showing their bodies surrounded by flames, indicating their sentence to execution. The reading of sentences was conducted with elaborate ceremony that emphasized the legal and religious authority of the Inquisition. Each prisoner's case was summarized in detail, including their crimes, their responses during investigation, and the reasoning behind their sentence. This public recitation served multiple purposes. It justified the Inquisition's actions, it educated spectators about heretical behaviors, and it demonstrated the thoroughness of the institution's procedures. The sermons delivered during auto de fe ceremonies were carefully crafted pieces of religious and political propaganda. They explained the theological basis for the Inquisition's authority. They justified the punishment of heretics, and they called on spectators to remain vigilant against religious deviation in their own communities. These sermons often lasted for hours and were delivered by prominent religious figures who had been selected for their oratorical skills and their loyalty to the institution. The auto de fe served multiple purposes beyond the obvious one of punishing heretics. It was a form of public theater that reinforced social hierarchies and religious orthodoxy. It demonstrated the power of the monarchy and the church to the general population. It provided an outlet for community tensions and scapegoating. And it served as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to deviate from approved religious practices. The ceremonies followed a carefully choreographed script. Prisoners would be brought out wearing distinctive garments called sanbenitos, which indicated their crimes and sentences. Those who had confessed and been reconciled to the church wore yellow robes with red crosses. Those who refused to confess or who had relapsed into heresy wore black robes decorated with flames and demons. The most serious offenders, those sentenced to death, wore robes showing their bodies surrounded by flames. The psychological impact of these ceremonies on both participants and spectators cannot be overstated. For the prisoners, it was the culmination of months or years of imprisonment, interrogation, and uncertainty. Many had been broken psychologically long before they reached the auto de fe. They might confess to crimes they hadn't committed, denounce family members and friends, or beg for forgiveness for practices they had never engaged in. For the spectators, the auto de fe created a complex mix of emotions. There was the vicarious satisfaction of seeing justice done, the relief of not being among the accused, and the fear that they might someday find themselves in the prisoner's position. Many people attended these ceremonies not out of bloodthirst, but out of social obligation. Failure to attend might itself be seen as suspicious. The Spanish Inquisition's methods of gathering information created a network of informants that penetrated every level of society.
The institution actively encouraged denunciation by offering rewards, promising anonymity, and creating social pressure to inform on suspicious behavior.
This system of mutual surveillance had effects that went far beyond the detection of actual heresy.
The recruitment and management of informants was one of the most sophisticated aspects of the Inquisition's operations.
The institution developed detailed procedures for identifying potential informants, evaluating their reliability, and maintaining their loyalty over long periods. Informants came from all social classes, included servants, merchants, clergy, government officials, and even family members of suspected heretics. The motivations that led people to become informants were complex and varied. Some were driven by genuine religious fervor and believed they were serving God by reporting heretical behavior. Others were motivated by personal grievances, jealousy, or the desire for revenge against neighbors or competitors. Many were pressured into cooperation by threats or promises of protection for themselves or their families. The Inquisition also created economic incentives for denunciation through its policies regarding property confiscation and reward payments. Informants who provided information that led to convictions might receive portions of the confiscated property of their victims. This created a perverse economy where people could profit financially from the persecution of their neighbors and associates. The system of anonymous denunciation was particularly corrosive to community relationships and social trust. The Inquisition accepted accusations from anonymous sources, which meant that anyone could denounce anyone else without fear of retaliation or accountability. This policy encouraged false accusations based on personal vendettas, business disputes, or social rivalries. The psychological impact of this system of mutual surveillance extended far beyond the direct participants. Even people who were never accused or investigated learned to modify their behavior to avoid arousing suspicion. They censored their conversations, avoided suspicious associations, and conformed to religious and social expectations even in their private lives. The documentation and record-keeping associated with the informant system created massive archives that contained intimate details about thousands of families and individuals. These records included not just accusations and evidence, but also background information about social relationships, economic activities, and personal histories. The mere existence of these archives created a form of social control that extended far beyond the people who were actually investigated. The training provided to informants reflected the Inquisition's sophisticated understanding of investigative techniques and psychological manipulation. Informants were taught to recognize signs of heretical behavior, to ask probing questions without arousing suspicion, and to gather evidence that would be useful in legal proceedings. They were also trained in techniques for maintaining their cover identities and protecting themselves from discovery. The network of informants created by the Inquisition was not just a tool for gathering information. It was also a mechanism for social control that shaped behavior throughout Spanish society. The knowledge that anyone might be an informant created a climate of caution and conformity that discouraged dissent and innovation. People learned to trust no one completely and to guard their words and actions carefully at all times. The impact of this surveillance system on family relationships was particularly devastating. Husbands and wives learned to watch each other for signs of heretical behavior. Parents became suspicious of their children's activities and associations. Children were taught to report on their parents' private conversations and religious practices. The institution systematically destroyed the bonds of trust and loyalty that held families together. Families found themselves torn apart by accusation and counter-accusation. Business partnerships dissolved when partners suspected each other of religious deviation. Long-standing friendships ended when friends informed on each other to protect themselves from suspicion. The converso community was particularly devastated because they were under constant scrutiny and often had complex family histories that made them vulnerable to accusation. The Inquisition's definition of heretical behavior was remarkably broad and often culturally specific. Lighting candles on Friday evening could be evidence of secret Jewish practice, but it could also simply be a family tradition maintained for sentimental reasons. Refusing to eat pork might indicate secret adherence to Jewish dietary laws, but it could also reflect personal taste or medical advice. Taking baths on Fridays or Saturdays could suggest Islamic or Jewish ritual observance, but it could also simply be a matter of personal hygiene. This broad definition of suspicious behavior meant that almost anyone could be accused of heresy if they had enemies or if circumstances turned against them. A business competitor might report suspicious religious practices to eliminate a rival. A disgruntled servant might accuse a master of heretical behavior out of revenge. A neighbor might inform on someone simply to deflect suspicion from themselves. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on intellectual and cultural life was profound and lasting. The institution created a climate of intellectual conformity that stifled innovation and creativity. Scholars learned to avoid topics that might be considered controversial. Artists and writers censored themselves to avoid unwanted attention from inquisitors. Libraries and private book collections were scrutinized for heretical or inappropriate materials. The process of intellectual censorship extended far beyond the simple banning of books. The Inquisition created elaborate procedures for reviewing manuscripts before publication, examining imported books at ports and border crossings, and conducting periodic inspections of libraries and bookshops. These procedures created a comprehensive system of intellectual control that affected every aspect of scholarly and cultural life. The criteria used to determine whether books or ideas were heretical were often arbitrary and reflected the political and social prejudices of the inquisitors rather than clear theological principles. Works that challenged established authorities, questioned traditional practices, or suggested alternative ways of understanding religious or philosophical questions were likely to be banned regardless of their actual content or scholarly merit. The impact of this censorship on Spanish universities was particularly severe. These institutions had been centers of learning and intellectual exchange that attracted scholars from throughout Europe. Under the Inquisition, they became increasingly isolated and conservative,
focused on defending orthodox positions rather than exploring new ideas or challenging existing knowledge. The atmosphere of intellectual fear created by the Inquisition discouraged the kind of open debate and critical thinking that was essential for scholarly progress. Professors learned to present only approved viewpoints and to avoid raising questions that might be considered controversial. Students were discouraged from challenging their teachers or pursuing independent research that might lead to dangerous conclusions. The broader cultural impact of this intellectual repression was enormous. Spain had been one of the most culturally diverse and intellectually vibrant societies in medieval Europe, with traditions of scholarship that bridged Christian, Jewish, and Islamic learning. The Inquisition systematically destroyed this intellectual ecosystem, replacing it with rigid orthodoxy and conformity. The loss of Jewish and Muslim scholars and their libraries represented a catastrophic loss of accumulated knowledge and intellectual tradition. These communities had preserved and transmitted classical texts, developed innovative approaches to philosophy and science, and created new forms of artistic and literary expression. Their persecution and exile impoverished Spanish intellectual life immeasurably. The Inquisition's suspicion of foreign ideas and influences also isolated Spain from the broader currents of European intellectual development. Books from other countries were subject to intensive scrutiny, and Spanish scholars were discouraged from traveling abroad or maintaining correspondence with foreign colleagues. This isolation contributed to Spain's gradual decline as an intellectual and cultural center. The impact on artistic and literary creation was equally significant. Writers learned to embed their ideas in allegory and metaphor to avoid direct confrontation with inquisitorial censors. Artists developed techniques for concealing controversial messages in apparently orthodox religious imagery. Musicians and performers modified traditional works to remove elements that might be considered problematic. This tradition of coded communication created works of remarkable subtlety and complexity, but it also limited the development of direct and open artistic expression. Spanish culture became characterized by layers of hidden meaning and symbolic representation that required special knowledge to decode. The energy that might have been devoted to bold artistic innovation was instead channeled into careful self-censorship and defensive coding. The Inquisition maintained an index of prohibited books that banned works considered dangerous to faith or morals. This index included not only obviously heretical texts, but also works of philosophy, science, and literature that were deemed inappropriate for Christian readers. Possession of prohibited books could lead to arrest and investigation, so many people destroyed their personal libraries rather than risk accusation. This intellectual repression had consequences that extended far beyond religion. Spain, which had been one of the intellectual centers of medieval Europe, began to fall behind other nations in science, philosophy, and literature. The free exchange of ideas that had characterized Spanish intellectual life during the Convivencia, the period of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish coexistence, was replaced by rigid orthodoxy and intellectual timidity.
Universities, which had been centers of learning and debate, became increasingly conservative institutions focused on approved theological and philosophical positions.
Professors learned to avoid controversial topics and to present only officially sanctioned viewpoints. Students were discouraged from asking probing questions or challenging established authorities. The spirit of intellectual inquiry that had made Spanish universities renowned throughout Europe was gradually extinguished. The economic consequences of the Spanish Inquisition were as significant as the intellectual ones. The converso community had been economically vital to Spanish society, providing much of the merchant class, many skilled artisans, and numerous professionals, including doctors, lawyers, and government administrators. The persecution of this community disrupted commercial networks, destroyed accumulated expertise, and created economic instability in many regions. The systematic destruction of converso economic networks had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate victims. These networks had connected Spanish cities to international markets throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. They had facilitated the exchange of goods, capital, and commercial information that was essential for Spanish economic development. When these networks were destroyed through persecution and exile, Spain lost crucial connections to the wider world economy. The confiscation of property from suspected heretics created short-term revenue for the Spanish crown and the Inquisition itself, but the long-term economic impact was devastating. Entire industries and commercial sectors were disrupted when their leading practitioners were arrested, executed, or forced to flee. The specialized knowledge and skills that had been accumulated over generations were lost when the people who possessed them were destroyed or scattered. The impact on specific industries was particularly severe. The silk industry, which had been largely controlled by converso families, never fully recovered from the persecution of its practitioners. The spice trade, international banking, and luxury crafts all suffered similar disruptions. Spanish cities that had been major commercial centers found themselves increasingly isolated from international markets as their converso merchants were eliminated. The psychological impact of property confiscation extended far beyond its direct victims. The knowledge that successful business people could lose everything through accusations of heresy created a climate of economic uncertainty that discouraged investment and entrepreneurship. Wealthy families began moving their assets to other countries where they would be safer from confiscation. This capital flight deprived Spain of the resources needed for economic development and modernization. The Inquisition's impact on credit and financial relationships was particularly destructive. Many converso families had been involved in banking and money lending, activities that required high levels of trust and long-term relationships. The persecution of these families disrupted credit networks and made it difficult for Spanish businesses to obtain the capital they needed for expansion and development. The regional variations in economic impact reflected the geographic distribution of converso communities and the intensity of inquisitorial persecution. Cities like Seville, Toledo, and Barcelona, which had large converso populations, experienced severe economic disruption. Rural areas with fewer conversos were less directly affected, but they still suffered from the broader economic instability created by the persecution. The demographic impact of persecution also had long-term economic consequences. The expulsion or elimination of skilled workers, professionals, and entrepreneurs left gaps in the Spanish economy that were difficult to fill. The loss of human capital was as significant as the loss of physical assets and financial resources. The international reputation of Spain was also damaged by the economic disruption caused by the Inquisition. Foreign merchants and investors became increasingly reluctant to do business with Spanish partners who might be subject to sudden arrest and property confiscation. This reluctance further isolated Spain from international markets and contributed to its economic decline relative to other European countries. When the Inquisition confiscated the property of suspected heretics, it didn't just impoverish individuals, it disrupted entire economic ecosystems. A merchant's arrest might destroy trading relationships built up over decades. The confiscation of a craftsman's workshop might eliminate employment for numerous workers. The prosecution of a banker or moneylender might destabilize credit relationships throughout a region. The monarchy initially benefited from these confiscations, which provided substantial revenue for royal projects. But the long-term economic impact was negative. Spain lost much of its commercial expertise and international trading connections. The constant threat of property confiscation discouraged investment and entrepreneurship. Capital flight became common as wealthy families moved their assets to other countries where they would be safer from confiscation. The Spanish Inquisition's territorial expansion followed the growth of Spanish political power. As Spain acquired new territories in Italy, the Netherlands, and the Americas, the Inquisition established tribunals in these regions as well. Each new tribunal brought Spanish methods of religious control to populations that had previously enjoyed different traditions of religious tolerance and legal procedure. In the Spanish Netherlands, the introduction of the Inquisition contributed to the rebellion that eventually led to Dutch independence. The Dutch had a tradition of religious tolerance and commercial freedom that clashed with Spanish methods of social control. The threat of the Inquisition, combined with heavy taxation and political repression, convinced many Dutch people that Spanish rule was incompatible with their way of life. In the Americas, the Inquisition took on additional dimensions related to colonial control and racial hierarchy. Indigenous populations were initially exempt from Inquisition jurisdiction, officially because they were considered new Christians who needed gentle instruction rather than harsh punishment. But this exemption also reflected the colonial view that indigenous people were somehow less capable of true heresy because they were not considered fully rational beings. The colonial Inquisition focused heavily on African slaves and people of mixed racial ancestry who were considered particularly prone to heretical beliefs and practices. This racial dimension of Inquisition persecution reinforced colonial hierarchies and provided another tool for social control in diverse colonial societies. The Spanish Inquisition's methods of investigation and punishment evolved over time, but they remained consistently focused on psychological pressure and social control rather than simple punishment. The institution developed sophisticated techniques for breaking down psychological resistance, manipulating family relationships, and extracting confessions that would implicate others.
One of the most insidious aspects of the system was the way it turned family members against each other. Prisoners were encouraged to inform on their relatives as a sign of their own repentance and cooperation. Parents were asked to testify against their children, spouses against each other, siblings against their brothers and sisters. The Inquisition argued that true Christian love required exposing the heretical behavior of loved ones so that their souls could be saved. This manipulation of family bonds created lasting trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Children who had been forced to testify against their parents carried guilt and shame for the rest of their lives. Spouses who had informed on each other found their marriages destroyed by betrayal and mistrust. Brothers and sisters who had denounced each other became permanent enemies, their relationships poisoned by the experience of Inquisition investigation. The psychological techniques used by the Inquisition were sophisticated for their time and remarkably effective. Interrogators were trained to detect lies through body language, verbal inconsistencies, and emotional responses. They used isolation, uncertainty, and fear to break down psychological resistance. They offered false hope of leniency to encourage confession, then used those confessions to extract more information about other suspected heretics. Many prisoners experienced what we would today recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They developed chronic anxiety, depression, and paranoia that persisted long after their release. Some never fully recovered their sense of safety or their ability to trust other people. The Inquisition's impact on individual psychology was as devastating as its impact on society as a whole. The institution also developed elaborate procedures for dealing with different categories of prisoners. First-time offenders who confessed and showed appropriate repentance might be reconciled to the church with relatively light penances, such as public humiliation, fines, or temporary imprisonment. Repeat offenders, or those who refused to confess, faced more severe penalties, including longer imprisonment, property confiscation, and exile. The most severe penalty, execution, was reserved for those who refused to confess their heresy or who relapsed after being reconciled to the church. But even this ultimate punishment was carried out with careful attention to religious and legal procedure. The church could not shed blood directly, so condemned prisoners were turned over to secular authorities for execution. This legal fiction allowed the church to maintain its claim to mercy while ensuring that heretics faced the ultimate penalty. The Spanish Inquisition's record-keeping was meticulous, creating an archive of persecution that provides unprecedented insight into the institution's operations. Inquisitors kept detailed records of every investigation, every confession, every sentence, and every execution. These records reveal not only the scale of the persecution, but also its geographic distribution, its social impact, and its evolution over time. The statistics that emerge from these records are staggering. Over the course of more than 3 centuries, the Spanish Inquisition investigated tens of thousands of cases. Thousands of people were executed, tens of thousands more were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile. Entire communities were disrupted or destroyed. Families were scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean as they fled Spanish territories to escape persecution.
But the numbers alone don't capture the full impact of the institution. The Spanish Inquisition created a culture of fear and suspicion that affected everyone, not just its direct victims. People learned to watch their words carefully, to avoid suspicious associations, and to conform to religious and social expectations, even in their private lives. This culture of conformity and fear persisted long after the Inquisition itself lost most of its power. The institution's impact on women was particularly severe, though this aspect of its history is often overlooked. Women were considered especially susceptible to heretical influences and were subject to particular scrutiny regarding their religious practices and moral behavior. The Inquisition's records show that women were accused of heresy at higher rates than men and were often subjected to different types of investigation and punishment. Female prisoners were particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse and exploitation by their captors, though the official records rarely acknowledge this reality. Women who were pregnant or nursing faced the additional trauma of separation from their children, often for years at a time. Many women emerged from Inquisition prisons to find their families destroyed, their reputations ruined, and their economic prospects eliminated. The Inquisition also targeted women who were considered too independent or too knowledgeable about religious matters. Female healers, midwives, and herbalists were often suspected of witchcraft or of maintaining pre-Christian religious practices. Women who could read Latin or who displayed too much theological knowledge might be suspected of heretical learning. This targeting of knowledgeable women contributed to the suppression of female intellectual and professional advancement in Spanish society. The Spanish Inquisition's relationship with popular culture and folk traditions was complex and often contradictory. While the institution officially promoted Orthodox Catholic practices, it also had to deal with the reality that most people maintained a mixture of official religious observance and traditional folk beliefs and practices. Many of these folk traditions had roots in pre-Christian religions or in the syncretic cultures that had developed during centuries of religious coexistence. The Inquisition's approach to these popular traditions was selective and sometimes arbitrary. Some practices were tolerated or even incorporated into official Catholic observance, while others were condemned as heretical or superstitious. The determining factors often had more to do with politics and social control than with pure theological considerations. For example, certain folk healing practices might be tolerated if they were practiced by people with good social standing and clear Christian credentials, but condemned if practiced by people from suspect communities or backgrounds. This selective enforcement created additional uncertainty and fear, as people could never be sure which of their traditional practices might suddenly be deemed heretical. The Spanish Inquisition's decline was gradual and uneven, lasting well into the 19th century. The institution's power began to wane during the 18th century as Enlightenment ideas spread throughout Europe and as Spanish political and economic power declined relative to other European nations. The Bourbon monarchy that came to power in Spain in 1700 was less committed to religious persecution than their Habsburg predecessors had been. The French invasion of Spain during the Napoleonic Wars dealt a severe blow to the Inquisition's authority and legitimacy.
The French occupation government officially abolished the institution, though it was restored when Spanish independence was regained.
However, the restoration was incomplete and half-hearted, reflecting changing attitudes toward religious tolerance and individual rights. The final abolition of the Spanish Inquisition came in 1834, during a period of liberal political reform. By that time, the institution had become an embarrassment to Spanish modernizers who wanted their country to be seen as progressive and enlightened. The formal end of the Inquisition was largely symbolic, as it had already lost most of its practical power and social influence. But the cultural and psychological impact of more than 3 centuries of systematic religious persecution could not be erased by legislative decree. Spanish society retained many of the characteristics that had been shaped by the Inquisition experience: suspicion of diversity, conformity to authority, and reluctance to engage in open debate about controversial topics. The legacy of the Spanish Inquisition extended far beyond Spain's borders and far beyond its official existence. The institution became a symbol of religious fanaticism and political oppression throughout Europe and the Americas. The phrase Spanish Inquisition entered multiple languages as a synonym for arbitrary persecution and cruel interrogation. Protestant countries used the Spanish Inquisition as propaganda to demonstrate the inherent corruption and cruelty of the Catholic Church. This propaganda often exaggerated the institution's cruelty and scope, but it was based on real experiences of persecution and oppression that were well documented. The black legend of Spanish cruelty that developed in Northern Europe was partly accurate and partly exaggerated, but it reflected genuine concerns about Spanish methods of social and religious control. The Spanish Inquisition also influenced the development of concepts of religious liberty and individual rights. Thinkers like Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers used the Spanish example to argue for the importance of religious tolerance and the dangers of combining religious and political authority. The American and French revolutionary concepts of separation of church and state were partly reactions against the Spanish model of religious political integration. Even in the modern era, the Spanish Inquisition continues to serve as a historical reference point for discussions about religious extremism, political persecution, and the abuse of judicial authority. Human rights activists often invoke the Spanish Inquisition when describing modern examples of systematic persecution or the use of confession under duress. The institution's methods of investigation and psychological pressure have been studied by psychologists and criminologists interested in understanding how authority figures can manipulate and coerce their subjects. The Inquisition's techniques for breaking down psychological resistance and extracting confessions provided a template that has unfortunately been used by various modern authoritarian regimes. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on Jewish and Muslim communities was particularly lasting and traumatic. For Sephardic Jews, the experience of persecution in Spain became a defining element of cultural memory that persisted for centuries after the expulsion.
Sephardic communities throughout the Mediterranean and beyond maintained traditions, languages, and cultural practices that preserved the memory of their Spanish origins while also commemorating the persecution that forced them to leave. The Ladino language, spoken by Sephardic Jews, preserved medieval Spanish vocabulary and grammatical structures long after the Spanish language itself had evolved. Sephardic music, cuisine, and religious practices maintained elements of Spanish culture, while also incorporating the influences of the various countries where the refugees settled. This preservation of Spanish cultural elements alongside memories of persecution created a complex relationship with Spanish identity that persisted for generations. For Muslim communities, the impact was somewhat different because the final expulsion of the moriscos came later and was more complete than the Jewish expulsion. Entire regions of Spain that had been predominantly Muslim for centuries were emptied of their populations. The economic and cultural knowledge that these communities had accumulated over generations was lost to Spain forever. The architectural and artistic legacy of Muslim Spain was largely preserved, but the human knowledge, the agricultural techniques, craft traditions, commercial networks, and intellectual achievements was scattered across North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. This loss impoverished Spanish culture while enriching the lands where the refugees settled. The psychological and social mechanisms that the Spanish Inquisition used to maintain control provide important lessons for understanding how societies can be manipulated and controlled through fear and suspicion. The institution's success depended not just on its formal powers of arrest and punishment, but on its ability to enlist ordinary citizens as informants and collaborators. The system of mutual surveillance that the Inquisition created was remarkably effective at deterring dissent and maintaining conformity. People learned to monitor their own behavior and that of their neighbors for signs of deviance. They internalized the institution's values and standards, becoming their own censors and judges. This self-policing mechanism was perhaps more effective than any external enforcement could have been. The Spanish Inquisition also demonstrated how religious and moral authority could be weaponized for political purposes. While the institution claimed to be motivated by concern for souls and religious truth, it was also clearly serving the political goals of the monarchy and the social goals of dominant groups within Spanish society. This instrumentalization of religious authority provided a template that has been used by various authoritarian movements throughout history. The institution's ability to adapt and persist for more than 3 centuries also provides insights into how oppressive systems can maintain themselves over time. The Spanish Inquisition evolved its methods and targets in response to changing social and political conditions, but it maintained its core mission of enforcing conformity and eliminating dissent. This adaptability allowed it to survive changes of dynasty, social transformation, and even military defeat. The Spanish Inquisition's relationship with education and intellectual development reveals how systematic persecution can impoverish entire societies culturally and intellectually. The institution's suspicion of learning and innovation created an atmosphere that discouraged intellectual curiosity and creativity.
Spain, which had been one of the most intellectually vibrant societies in medieval Europe, became increasingly backward and isolated as other European countries embraced new ideas and technologies.
This intellectual decline was not just a matter of specific books being banned or particular ideas being suppressed.
The more fundamental problem was that the Inquisition created a culture in which intellectual risk-taking was dangerous and conformity was rewarded.
Scholars learned to avoid controversial topics and to present only conventional wisdom.
Students learned to accept authority rather than to question and investigate.
The long-term consequences of this intellectual impoverishment were profound. Spain fell behind other European countries in scientific development, technological innovation, and economic modernization. The country that had produced some of the greatest philosophers, scientists, and artists of the medieval period became a cultural backwater that imported ideas and technologies from other nations. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on the development of law and legal procedure was also significant, though often overlooked.
The institution operated according to inquisitorial rather than adversarial legal principles, which meant that judges took an active role in investigating cases rather than simply presiding over contests between opposing advocates.
This system gave enormous power to judicial authorities and provided few protections for the rights of the accused.
The Spanish Inquisition's legal procedures influenced the development of criminal law in Spanish territories and continue to influence legal systems in many countries that were once part of the Spanish Empire.
The emphasis on confession, the use of secret evidence, and the presumption of guilt rather than innocence all became characteristic features of legal systems influenced by Spanish practice. These legal traditions created lasting problems for the development of democratic institutions and individual rights in many Spanish-influenced societies. The assumption that judicial authorities should be trusted with enormous discretionary power, and that the accused should prove their innocence rather than be presumed innocent, created legal cultures that were hostile to individual rights and democratic accountability.
The role of the Spanish Inquisition in shaping concepts of racial and ethnic identity was particularly important in colonial contexts.
The institution's focus on blood purity and genealogical investigation created elaborate systems for classifying people according to their ancestry and presumed religious background. These classification systems became templates for later systems of racial hierarchy and discrimination.
In colonial Spanish America, the Inquisition's emphasis on limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood, contributed to the development of complex caste systems that classified people according to their European, indigenous, and African ancestry.
These systems created hierarchies of privilege and discrimination that persisted long after the end of colonial rule and continue to influence social relations in many Latin American countries. The Spanish Inquisition's investigation techniques also contributed to the development of genealogical research and record-keeping systems. The institution's need to trace family histories and investigate religious ancestry led to the creation of extensive archives that preserved information about families and communities over multiple generations. These records, while created for oppressive purposes, now provide valuable historical information about social and demographic patterns in early modern Spain and its territories. The psychological impact of living under the Spanish Inquisition created cultural patterns that persisted long after the institution itself was abolished. Generations of Spanish people learned to be cautious about expressing controversial opinions, to avoid associations that might be considered suspicious, and to conform to social expectations even in their private lives. This culture of caution and conformity affected Spanish intellectual and artistic development for centuries. Writers learned to use allegory and metaphor to express ideas that might be considered dangerous if stated directly. Artists developed techniques for embedding subversive messages in apparently conventional works. Ordinary citizens learned to live double lives, maintaining public facades that concealed their private thoughts and beliefs. These cultural adaptations, while necessary for survival under an oppressive system, also limited Spanish creativity and innovation. The energy and talent that might have been devoted to bold new ideas and artistic experiments was instead channeled into coded communication and careful self-censorship. Spanish culture became characterized by indirection, subtlety, and hidden meanings rather than by direct expression and open debate. The Spanish Inquisition's influence on religious practice and belief was paradoxical. While the institution claimed to promote pure Catholic faith, its methods often had the opposite effect. The emphasis on external conformity rather than internal belief led to widespread religious hypocrisy and superficiality. People learned to go through the motions of religious observance while maintaining private skepticism or alternative beliefs. The institution's harsh methods also created resentment against religious authority that persisted for generations. Many Spanish people developed a cynical attitude toward the church and its representatives, viewing them as tools of political oppression rather than spiritual guides. This anti-clerical sentiment became a persistent feature of Spanish political culture and contributed to conflicts between church and state that continued into the 20th century. The Spanish Inquisition's treatment of women and gender relationships reveals important aspects of how the institution reinforced broader patterns of social control and hierarchy. Women were considered particularly susceptible to heretical influences and were subjected to intense scrutiny regarding their religious and moral behavior. This scrutiny extended into the most intimate aspects of women's lives, including their sexual behavior, their child-rearing practices, and their relationships with family members. The institution's emphasis on confession and denunciation created particular problems for women, who were often pressured to inform on their husbands, children, and other family members. This pressure to betray family loyalties created lasting trauma and destroyed many women's sense of their own moral integrity. Women who cooperated with the Inquisition often experienced guilt and shame that persisted for the rest of their lives, while those who refused to cooperate faced severe punishment. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on economic development was complex and varied by region and time period. In the short term, the institution provided substantial revenue to the Spanish crown through property confiscations and fines. This revenue helped fund Spanish military campaigns and colonial expansion, but it came at the cost of destroying productive economic relationships and discouraging investment and entrepreneurship. The long-term economic impact was largely negative.
The persecution of merchant and artisan communities disrupted commercial networks and eliminated accumulated expertise. The constant threat of property confiscation discouraged people from investing in long-term economic development. Capital flight became common as wealthy families moved their assets to countries where they would be safer from confiscation. The Spanish Inquisition's methods of social control were studied and imitated by other authoritarian institutions throughout Europe and beyond. The institution's techniques for gathering information, manipulating family relationships, and maintaining psychological pressure on dissidents provided a template that was used by various secret police organizations and political persecution systems. The institution's emphasis on ideological conformity and its methods for detecting and punishing deviants influenced the development of modern totalitarian systems. The concept of thought crime, the use of family members as informants, and the emphasis on confession and self-criticism all have precedence in Spanish Inquisition practice. The Spanish Inquisition's legacy in literature and popular culture has been enormous, though often distorted by centuries of propaganda and sensationalism. The institution became a symbol of religious fanaticism and political oppression that writers and artists used to explore themes of persecution, resistance, and the abuse of power. Literary works from Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum to Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov have used the Spanish Inquisition as a reference point for discussing the relationship between religious authority and human freedom. These works, while often historically inaccurate in their details, captured important truths about the psychological and social impact of systematic persecution. Modern scholarship on the Spanish Inquisition has revealed both the institution's genuine horrors and the ways in which its historical image was distorted by centuries of propaganda. Recent historical research has provided more accurate statistics on the number of victims and more nuanced understanding of the institution's methods and motivations. This scholarship has confirmed that while some aspects of the Black Legend were exaggerated, the fundamental reality of systematic persecution and oppression was accurate. Contemporary historians have also revealed the ways in which the Spanish Inquisition was used as a tool for social and economic control that went far beyond its stated religious purposes. The institution served the interests of the monarchy, the established church hierarchy, and dominant social groups by eliminating competition, consolidating power, and maintaining social hierarchies. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on family structures and social relationships created lasting changes in Spanish society that persisted long after the institution was abolished. The experience of having family members inform on each other, of living under constant surveillance, and of never knowing who could be trusted created patterns of social interaction characterized by suspicion, formality, and emotional distance. These social patterns affected everything from marriage relationships to business partnerships to friendships. Spanish society became characterized by elaborate codes of behavior designed to avoid giving offense or arousing suspicion. People learned to communicate through indirection and subtext rather than direct expression. Social relationships became more formal and hierarchical as people sought the protection of established authority figures and avoided associations that might be considered risky.
The institution's emphasis on genealogy and blood purity also created lasting obsessions with family lineage and social status that influenced Spanish culture for centuries. Families went to enormous lengths to document their Christian ancestry and to avoid any hint of Jewish or Muslim heritage. This emphasis on bloodline created rigid social hierarchies based on ancestry rather than merit or achievement. The Spanish Inquisition's methods of investigation and record-keeping created an unprecedented archive of personal information that the institution used to maintain control over Spanish society. These records contained intimate details about thousands of families, including their religious practices, financial dealings, political associations, and personal relationships. The mere existence of these records created a form of social control that extended far beyond the people who were actually investigated. The knowledge that the Inquisition possessed detailed information about their lives made people cautious about their behavior even when they were not under direct surveillance. Families destroyed documents and heirlooms that might be considered suspicious. People avoided associations that might be recorded in Inquisition files. The archives themselves became a form of social control that influenced behavior throughout Spanish society. The Spanish Inquisition's treatment of intellectual and artistic expression created a culture of coded communication that influenced Spanish literature, art, and philosophy for centuries. Writers learned to embed their real messages in allegory, symbolism, and metaphor that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the reader's perspective and knowledge. This tradition of indirect communication created works of remarkable subtlety and complexity, but it also limited the development of clear, direct expression of controversial ideas. Spanish intellectual culture became characterized by layers of meaning and hidden significance that required special knowledge to decode. This created barriers to communication and understanding that persist in some aspects of Spanish culture even today. The Spanish Inquisition's influence on colonial administration and law created lasting patterns of governance in Spanish America that emphasized centralized control, religious conformity, and social hierarchy. The institution's methods were adapted to colonial conditions and used to maintain Spanish authority over diverse indigenous and mixed populations. Colonial Inquisition tribunals became centers of political and social control that went far beyond their religious mandate. They investigated political dissent, regulated commercial activity, and maintained social hierarchies based on race and class. These functions made the Inquisition an integral part of the colonial system of domination and control. The legal and administrative traditions established by the Spanish Inquisition influenced the development of government institutions throughout the Spanish Empire. The emphasis on centralized authority, secret investigation, and presumption of guilt became characteristic features of colonial administration that persisted long after independence. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on women's lives and gender relationships reveals important aspects of how the institution reinforced patriarchal social structures while also creating new forms of female vulnerability and oppression. Women were subjected to particular scrutiny regarding their religious behavior, their sexual conduct, and their family relationships. The institution's emphasis on confession and denunciation created special problems for women,
who were often caught between loyalty to their families and pressure to cooperate with religious authorities. Women who informed on their husbands or children faced social condemnation and personal guilt, while those who refused to cooperate faced imprisonment and punishment. The Spanish Inquisition's investigation of female religious expression also limited women's spiritual autonomy and intellectual development. Women who displayed too much religious knowledge or who claimed special spiritual experiences were suspected of heresy or possession. This suspicion discouraged female religious leadership and limited women's participation in intellectual and spiritual life. The institution's treatment of sexuality and marriage relationships created additional forms of control over women's lives. The Inquisition investigated cases of bigamy, adultery, and other sexual offenses, often using these investigations to control and punish women who violated social expectations about female behavior. The Spanish Inquisition's economic impact extended beyond the immediate effects of property confiscation and fines. The institution's operations disrupted entire economic sectors and regions, creating long-term changes in Spanish economic development that influenced the country's position in European and world commerce. The persecution of converso merchants destroyed many of the commercial networks that had connected Spain to international markets. These networks had been built up over generations and represented enormous accumulated knowledge about foreign markets, trading practices, and financial relationships. When converso families fled Spain or were destroyed by persecution, this knowledge was lost to the Spanish economy. The institution's impact on artisan communities was similarly devastating. Many skilled trades were dominated by converso families who had developed specialized techniques and maintained quality standards over generations. The persecution of these communities led to a decline in Spanish manufacturing quality and innovation that affected the country's competitiveness in international markets. The Spanish Inquisition's emphasis on ideological conformity created cultural patterns that influenced Spanish responses to social and political change for centuries. The institution's success in suppressing dissent and maintaining orthodoxy created a society that was resistant to new ideas and innovations, even when those ideas might have been beneficial for economic or social development. This resistance to change became a characteristic feature of Spanish culture that influenced everything from technological adoption to political reform. Spanish society developed a preference for traditional ways of doing things and a suspicion of innovation that limited the country's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The institution's emphasis on authority and hierarchy also created cultural patterns that were hostile to democratic participation and individual initiative. Spanish society became characterized by deference to established authority and reluctance to challenge existing arrangements, even when those arrangements were clearly problematic. The Spanish Inquisition's methods of psychological manipulation and control provided techniques that were studied and adapted by later authoritarian institutions throughout the world. The institution's success in breaking down individual resistance and extracting confessions influenced the development of modern interrogation techniques and methods of thought control. The institution's emphasis on self-denunciation and confession created templates for the self-criticism sessions used by various 20th century totalitarian movements.
The techniques for turning family members against each other and for manipulating loyalty relationships were studied by secret police organizations and political persecution systems.
The Spanish Inquisition's use of public ceremonies and spectacle to maintain social control also influenced the development of modern propaganda techniques.
The auto de fe demonstrated how public rituals could be used to reinforce political authority and social hierarchies while creating emotional responses that supported the existing order.
The long-term psychological and social impact of the Spanish Inquisition created cultural patterns that influenced Spanish society long after the institution was formally abolished.
The experience of living under systematic persecution and surveillance created collective trauma that was passed down through generations.
This collective trauma manifested itself in various ways, including suspicion of authority, reluctance to trust strangers, and preference for private rather than public expression of controversial opinions. Spanish society retained many of the defensive characteristics that had developed as survival mechanisms under the Inquisition long after those mechanisms were no longer necessary. The institution's impact on Spanish national identity was profound and complex. On one hand, the Spanish Inquisition was seen as a symbol of Spanish religious devotion and cultural purity. On the other hand, it became a source of national shame and embarrassment as European attitudes toward religious tolerance changed during the Enlightenment. This ambivalent relationship with the Inquisition legacy influenced Spanish efforts at modernization and democratization. Progressive Spanish politicians and intellectuals had to confront the reality that the Inquisition was part of Spanish history, while also trying to create a modern, tolerant society that rejected the institution's values and methods.
The Spanish Inquisition's influence on the development of concepts of religious liberty and individual rights was paradoxical but important.
While the institution represented the antithesis of these values, its excesses provided powerful arguments for the importance of protecting individual conscience and limiting the power of religious and political authorities. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire used the Spanish Inquisition as a prime example of why church and state should be separated, and why individuals needed protection from arbitrary persecution. The institution's methods demonstrated the dangers of combining religious and political authority and provided compelling arguments for constitutional limitations on government power. The American and French revolutionary concepts of religious liberty and individual rights were partly developed as responses to the Spanish model of religious political integration. The founders of these new democratic systems were determined to avoid creating institutions that could become as oppressive and arbitrary as the Spanish Inquisition had been. The Spanish Inquisition's treatment of different ethnic and religious communities provided early examples of systematic persecution based on ancestry and cultural identity. The institution's emphasis on blood purity and its investigation of family genealogies created templates for later forms of ethnic and racial persecution. The techniques developed by the Spanish Inquisition for identifying, tracking, and controlling minority populations were studied and adapted by various modern authoritarian movements. The institution's methods for destroying community solidarity and turning group members against each other became standard techniques for political and ethnic persecution. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on the development of international law and human rights concepts was also significant. The institution's excesses contributed to growing recognition that individuals needed protection from arbitrary persecution, and that certain forms of treatment were unacceptable regardless of the alleged justification. The concept of crimes against humanity and the development of international human rights law were partly responses to historical examples of systematic persecution, like the Spanish Inquisition. The institution's methods provided clear examples of the kinds of treatment that needed to be prohibited and prevented in any civilized society. The Spanish Inquisition's influence on the development of modern criminal justice systems was complex and often negative. The institution's emphasis on confession, its use of secret evidence, and its presumption of guilt created legal traditions that were hostile to individual rights and due process protections. Many countries that were influenced by Spanish legal traditions had to undergo extensive legal reforms to develop criminal justice systems that provided adequate protection for the rights of the accused. This process of legal reform was often difficult and incomplete, as established legal cultures resisted changes that challenged traditional assumptions about judicial authority and individual rights. The Spanish Inquisition's impact on educational and intellectual development created lasting problems for Spanish society that influenced the country's economic and social development for centuries. The institution's suppression of intellectual curiosity and innovation contributed to Spanish backwardness in science, technology, and economic development. Spain's decline from its position as a leading European power was partly due to the intellectual and cultural impoverishment created by centuries of inquisitorial control. The country lost much of its capacity for innovation and adaptation, making it increasingly unable to compete with other European nations that embraced new ideas and technologies. The process of recovering from this intellectual decline was slow and difficult, requiring not just institutional reforms, but also cultural changes that encouraged intellectual risk-taking and creativity. Spanish efforts at modernization were repeatedly hampered by cultural patterns that had been shaped by centuries of inquisitorial control. The Spanish Inquisition's legacy in contemporary discussions of religious freedom and human rights remains powerful and relevant. The institution serves as a historical reference point for understanding how religious authority can be abused and how societies can be destroyed by systematic persecution and intolerance. Modern human rights activists often invoke the Spanish Inquisition when describing contemporary examples of religious persecution or political oppression. The institution's methods provide clear examples of the kinds of treatment that international human rights law seeks to prevent and prohibit. The Spanish Inquisition also serves as a reminder of how quickly tolerant societies can be transformed into oppressive ones when fear and prejudice are allowed to override respect for individual rights and human dignity. The institution's success in creating a climate of suspicion and mutual surveillance demonstrates how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic oppression when they are motivated by fear and social pressure. As we reach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of history, it's important to remember that the Spanish Inquisition was not an aberration or an accident, but rather the logical result of combining religious fanaticism with political power and social prejudice. The institution's methods were systematic, deliberate, and effective at achieving their goals of social control and religious conformity. The thousands of individuals who suffered under the Spanish Inquisition were not just statistics or historical abstractions, but real people with families, dreams, and contributions to make to their communities. Their persecution impoverished not just themselves, but the entire societies that destroyed them. The knowledge, creativity, and human potential that was lost to persecution can never be recovered. The Spanish Inquisition's legacy serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of combining religious authority with political power, of allowing fear to override compassion, and of permitting prejudice to masquerade as righteousness. The institution demonstrates how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when they abandon respect for individual conscience and human dignity. Perhaps most importantly, the Spanish Inquisition reminds us that systematic oppression requires the cooperation of ordinary people who convince themselves that they are serving a higher good. The institution could not have functioned without the participation of thousands of informants, administrators, and passive bystanders who allowed persecution to continue in their names. The story of the Spanish Inquisition is ultimately a story about the choices that individuals and societies make when faced with diversity, uncertainty, and change. The Catholic monarchs and their successors chose fear over tolerance, conformity over creativity, and control over freedom. The consequences of those choices shaped Spanish society for centuries and continue to influence our world today. As we conclude this examination of one of history's most systematic examples of religious persecution, we must remember that the capacity for both good and evil exists within all human societies. The Spanish Inquisition was not the product of uniquely evil people, but rather the result of ordinary human weaknesses: fear, prejudice, greed, and the desire for power when they were allowed to operate without restraint. The vigilance required to prevent such institutions from arising again is constant and demanding. It requires respect for individual rights, even when those rights are unpopular, tolerance for diversity, even when it makes us uncomfortable, and the courage to speak out against injustice, even when it would be easier to remain silent. The legacy of the Spanish Inquisition lives on not just in history books, but in the ongoing struggle to create societies that respect human dignity and individual conscience. Every generation must choose whether to build bridges or walls, whether to embrace diversity or demand conformity, whether to trust in human goodness or surrender to fear and suspicion. The victims of the Spanish Inquisition cannot be brought back, but their memory can serve as an inspiration for building a better world, one in which religious freedom, individual rights, and human dignity are protected and cherished rather than sacrificed to the demands of political power and social control. In remembering their suffering, we honor their humanity and commit ourselves to preventing such tragedies from occurring again. Good night.